The sun was shining brightly through the small oval windows of the airplane as it prepared to take off from Los Angeles International Airport. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, chatting softly or scrolling through their phones. It was a typical morning flight bound for New York City, filled with business travelers, families heading east, and a few celebrities flying under the radar. Among them was Calvin, a seasoned airline pilot who had been flying for over 2 decades. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that made people instinctively step aside when he walked past. But beneath his professional exterior lay a man whose beliefs were stuck in another time. A man who believed certain privileges should only belong to those he deemed worthy. Calvin wasn't scheduled to fly this particular route. Instead, he was a passenger heading home after attending a training seminar. Still, being a pilot meant he expected special treatment wherever he went. As he boarded the plane, he scanned the first-class section with a critical eye. To his annoyance, every seat seemed occupied. There were no empty spots where he could stretch out or make himself comfortable. His frustration grew as he spotted someone sitting in what he considered his seat, the aisle seat closest to the front. It was a large leather chair reserved for premium passengers, and it was currently occupied by none other than Snoop Dogg. Snoop sat casually in the plush seat, dressed in a loose-fitting tracksuit and dark sunglasses despite being indoors. His long braids rested gently on his shoulders, and he wore headphones around his neck. A gold chain glinted faintly against his chest as he leaned back, scrolling through his phone with one hand while sipping orange juice with the other. He looked completely at ease, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him. For all intents and purposes, he appeared to be just another traveler trying to enjoy a quiet flight. But Calvin didn't see it that way. To Calvin, seeing Snoop Dogg lounging in first class felt like a personal insult. In his mind, these seats weren't meant for entertainers or musicians. They were for people like him, professionals, leaders, individuals who contributed something meaningful to society. Calvin's jaw tightened as he approached the row, his heavy boots echoing slightly against the carpeted floor. He stopped beside Snoop's seat and cleared his throat loudly, waiting for the rapper to acknowledge him. When Snoop finally glanced up, his expression was calm and unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked smoothly, his voice carrying the same laid-back tone that had made him famous. Calvin crossed his arms over his chest, his face reddening slightly. "You know," he began, his voice clipped and condescending, "some of us work hard to afford tickets like this. Maybe you should leave these seats for people who actually deserve them." The comment hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Several nearby passengers paused mid-conversation, their eyes darting between Calvin and Snoop. A young woman seated across the aisle, Laura, a journalist in her late 20s, watched intently, her pen hovering above the notebook in her lap. She had been jotting down notes for an article she planned to write about travel trends, but now found herself captivated by the unfolding drama. Snoop raised an eyebrow, clearly amused rather than offended. "Deserve 'em? Man, I paid for my ticket just like everybody else," he replied coolly, leaning forward slightly. "If you've got a problem with me sitting here, maybe you should talk to the airline, or better yet," he gestured toward the economy section at the back of the plane. "Maybe you could switch seats with somebody back there." His response drew a few chuckles from nearby passengers, further infuriating Calvin. The pilot's hands clenched into fists at his sides, though he tried to maintain some semblance of composure. "This isn't a joke," he snapped, lowering his voice but letting the venom seep through. "People like you don't understand what it means to earn respect. You think throwing money around makes you equal to the rest of us?" At this point, Laura couldn't stay silent any longer. She leaned forward in her seat, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Excuse me," she interjected, her voice firm but polite. "Are you seriously implying that someone doesn't deserve to sit here because of who they are?" Calvin turned, to face her, his piercing blue eyes narrowing. "I'm saying that some people have no business taking up space meant for others. If you knew anything about real achievement, you'd agree with me." Laura opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Snoop cut in again. This time his tone had shifted ever so slightly, still relaxed, but with an edge that commanded attention. "Look, man," he said, meeting Calvin's gaze directly. "You can stand there and talk all day about what you think I deserve. But the truth is, I earned my spot right here, same as anybody else. And if you've got a problem with that, well," he shrugged nonchalantly, "that's on you, not me." For a moment, Calvin stood frozen, his face flushed with anger. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and marched back toward the rear of the plane, muttering under his breath. The tension in the cabin eased slightly as he disappeared from view, though whispers continued to ripple through the rows of passengers. Laura sank back into her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. It wasn't every day you saw a celebrity get confronted so brazenly, and even less common to see them handle it with such grace. Something about Calvin's behavior struck her as deeply troubling, almost like a glimpse into a darker side of human nature. She decided then and there that this incident deserved more than just a passing mention in her article. It needed to be explored fully, dissected, and understood. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted off into the sky, the mood gradually returned to normal. Passengers resumed their conversations and flight attendants moved through the aisles offering drinks and snacks. Yet beneath the surface, a current of unease lingered. No one knew exactly how Calvin would react next, or whether the confrontation was truly over. For now, though, the immediate crisis had passed, leaving everyone to wonder what might come next. And somewhere in the back of the plane, Calvin sat stewing in his seat, his mind churning with thoughts of revenge and retribution. What started as a petty grievance was quickly spiraling into something much bigger and far more dangerous. As the plane soared smoothly through the clouds, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, creating a deceptive sense of calm. Most passengers had settled into their routines, reading books, watching movies on tiny screens, or dozing off after takeoff. But Calvin wasn't one of them. He sat stiffly in his economy-class seat near the back of the plane, gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind replayed the earlier confrontation with Snoop Dogg over and over again, each loop twisting his anger tighter like a coiled spring. Calvin couldn't let it go. How dare someone like him sit in first class? Someone who hadn't earned it through years of hard work and dedication, but instead made money by rapping about drugs and violence. To Calvin, it felt like an insult to everything he stood for, an affront to his values, his career, even his identity. Every time he thought about Snoop lounging comfortably in that plush seat, sipping orange juice as if he owned the place, Calvin's blood boiled hotter. He glanced at his watch. It was still early in the flight, which meant plenty of time to act. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Ignoring the curious glances from nearby passengers, he straightened his posture and marched toward the front of the plane. With every step, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Snoop anymore. This was about proving a point. About showing everyone that people like him didn't belong in spaces reserved for real achievers. When Calvin reached the curtain separating economy from first class, he paused for a moment, collecting himself. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it aside and stepped through. Instantly, all eyes turned to him. Passengers who had been chatting quietly fell silent, sensing the tension radiating off him. Laura, the young journalist seated across the aisle from Snoop, looked up from her notebook, her pen hovering midair. She recognized the same hostile energy she'd seen earlier and braced herself for what might come next. Snoop, however, remained unfazed. He was scrolling through his phone, headphones resting around his neck, when Calvin loomed over him once more. This time there was no pretense of politeness. Calvin leaned down, his face inches away from Snoop's, and sneered. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he spat, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the cabin. "Just because you've got fame and money doesn't mean you can disrespect people like me." Snoop lowered his phone slowly, meeting Calvin's gaze without flinching. "Man, I ain't disrespecting nobody," he replied calmly, his tone steady. "I paid for my ticket same as you. You got a problem with that, take it up with the airline. But Calvin wasn't listening. His frustration had morphed into something uglier, something fueled by years of bottled-up resentment and prejudice. Without warning, he reached out and shoved Snoop's shoulder, causing the rapper to rock slightly in his seat. Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers recoiled in shock. Some covered their mouths. Others exchanged horrified glances. Even the flight attendants froze mid-step, unsure how to handle the escalating situation. Laura sprang into action. Quietly slipping her phone out of her pocket, she began recording the scene, keeping the device low to avoid drawing attention. Her heart raced as she captured Calvin's aggressive stance and Snoop's surprisingly composed reaction. She knew this footage could be important, not just for documenting the incident, but for exposing the deeper issues at play. Still, part of her feared what might happen next. Would Calvin escalate further? Could things spiral completely out of control? For a brief moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Snoop spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Yo, man," he said, leaning forward slightly, his sunglasses reflecting Calvin's furious expression. "You really want to do this right now? On a plane, thousands of feet in the sky? You think acting like this makes you look tough? Nah, bro. All it does is show everybody exactly who you are." His words struck a nerve. Calvin's face twisted with rage, but beneath the surface a flicker of doubt crossed his features. For all his bravado, he hadn't anticipated being called out so directly, or so publicly. Passengers began whispering among themselves, their murmurs growing louder as they processed what they were witnessing. A middle-aged man seated nearby muttered, "This guy's losing it," while a mother shielded her child's eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. Laura seized the opportunity to intervene. Standing up from her seat, she addressed Calvin firmly. "Sir, please stop this. There's no need for violence or aggression here. If you have a complaint, we can address it appropriately once we land." Her voice carried authority, surprising even herself. She wasn't used to speaking up in situations like this, but something about the injustice of it all compelled her to act. Calvin whipped around to face her, his eyes blazing. "Stay out of this," he barked. "This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with us," Laura shot back, gesturing to the surrounding passengers. "We're all stuck on this plane together. Your behavior affects everyone, here, whether you realize it or not." Her words seemed to momentarily stagger Calvin, forcing him to glance around the cabin. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, some filled with fear, others with disgust. For the first time, he became acutely aware of how isolated he was, how much his actions had alienated him from the very people he claimed to represent. But instead of backing down, his anger only intensified. Turning back to Snoop, he jabbed a finger in the rapper's direction. "You think you're better than me? Huh? That's what this is all about, isn't it?" Snoop sighed deeply, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Nah, man. I don't think I'm better than nobody. But clearly, you've got some stuff you need to work out. Maybe try therapy or something, Lord knows it'd help." The comment elicited nervous laughter from a few passengers, breaking the tension ever so slightly. Calvin, however, was beyond reasoning. His fists clenched at his sides, and for a terrifying second it seemed like he might lash out again. But before he could make another move, a firm voice interrupted the chaos. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned to see Marcus, a middle-aged, African-American man seated a few rows behind Laura. He had risen from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and slacks, he exuded an aura of quiet confidence. His dark eyes locked onto Calvin, assessing the situation with practiced precision. Calvin hesitated, thrown off balance by the sudden intervention. "Mind your own business," he growled, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is my business," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm a retired Air Force officer, and I know a thing or two about handling conflict. Now, why don't you sit down and cool off before you embarrass yourself any further?" The weight of Marcus's words hit Calvin like a punch to the gut. For the first time since the confrontation began, he faltered. Glaring at Snoop one last time, He muttered something under his breath and stormed back toward the rear of the plane. Passengers watched him go, their expressions ranging from relief to lingering unease. Once Calvin was out of sight, the cabin erupted into murmurs. People began applauding softly, thanking Marcus for stepping in. Laura sank back into her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she stopped recording. She couldn't believe what had just happened, or how quickly things had escalated. But one thing was clear. This flight would never be forgotten by anyone on board, and somewhere in the back of the plane, Calvin sat fuming, plotting his next move. Whatever happened next, it was bound to shake the foundation of the flight, and perhaps reveal truths none of them were prepared to face. The confrontation had ended, but the ripple effects were far from over. As the plane continued its journey across the sky, an uneasy silence settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed, while others tried to distract themselves by reading or scrolling through their phones. Yet no matter how hard they tried, the memory of Calvin's outburst lingered like a storm cloud threatening to burst. Laura sat cross-legged in her seat, her laptop balanced precariously on the tray table. She stared intently at the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she typed notes about the incident. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why did he feel entitled to act so aggressively toward someone simply because of who they were? And more importantly, how many others like him existed? People hiding behind authority or privilege to justify their prejudice. She decided to dig deeper. Opening a new browser tab, she began searching for information about Calvin. It didn't take long before she found something alarming. According to several online forums and news articles, Calvin had a history of discriminatory behavior, not just against celebrities but also against colleagues and passengers. There were complaints filed against him years ago, alleging verbal abuse and even physical intimidation. Though none of these allegations led to severe consequences, they painted a troubling picture of a man whose biases ran deep. As Laura scrolled through the details, her stomach churned. She couldn't help but wonder why someone like Calvin had been allowed to keep working in such a high-stakes profession. Pilots were supposed to be leaders, trusted figures responsible for hundreds of lives every time they stepped into the cockpit. How could someone with such a toxic mindset hold that kind of power? Across the aisle, Snoop observed Laura quietly. He noticed the intensity in her expression, the way her eyes darted between the screen and her notebook. Curious, he leaned forward, slightly, and said, "You look like you're working on something important." Startled, Laura glanced up. "Oh, yeah," she stammered, unsure how much to share. After a pause, she added, "I'm just trying to understand what happened. Back there, that guy, he's not just angry, there's something bigger going on." Snoop nodded slowly, his sunglasses sliding down his nose just enough to reveal thoughtful eyes. "Man, I've seen it all before," he said, his voice low and steady. "People like him. They don't see us as equals. They think fame or success changes the rules somehow, but really, it's just another excuse to hate." His words struck a chord with Laura. She realized that this wasn't just about Calvin, it was about a system that let people like him operate unchecked. Determined to expose the truth, she asked, "Would you mind if I wrote about this? About what happened today?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, considering her question. Then, after a moment, he smiled faintly. "Go ahead. If it helps shine a light on the real issue, then do what you gotta do." Encouraged by his response, Laura returned to her laptop with renewed purpose. But she knew she couldn't tackle this alone. She needed someone else's perspective, someone who understood conflict and leadership better than she did. That's when she remembered Marcus. Marcus hadn't returned to his seat immediately after diffusing the situation. Instead, he'd stayed, near the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with the flight attendants. When Laura approached him, he greeted her with a warm smile. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone reassuring. "I need your help," Laura blurted out, her voice tinged with urgency. "What just happened back there? It's not okay. People need to know about it. But I want to make sure I get the story right. Can we talk?" Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to sit beside him. Over the next hour, they discussed everything, from Calvin's behavior to the broader implications of racism in professional settings. Marcus shared stories from his own life, recounting moments when he'd faced similar challenges during his time in the military. He explained how systemic biases often went unchallenged because those in power refused to acknowledge them. Sometimes, it's not enough to call out one person, Marcus said, his voice firm yet compassionate. You have to address the system that allows them to act this way, otherwise nothing changes. Laura listened intently, scribbling notes as fast as she could. She felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just as a journalist, but as someone who cared deeply about justice. By the end of their conversation, she had a clear plan. She would write an article exposing Calvin's actions and use it as a platform to discuss the larger issues at play. Meanwhile, Calvin sat stewing in his seat near the back of the plane. His anger hadn't subsided. If anything, it had grown stronger. Every glance from nearby passengers felt like judgment. Every whispered conversation sounded like ridicule. He clenched his jaw, replaying the events in his mind. How dare they side with him? Didn't they realize he was standing up for something important, for tradition, for order? His thoughts spiraled darker as he imagined landing in New York. Would the airline punish him for what happened? Would the media twist the story to paint him as the villain? The idea made his chest tighten with panic. No, he decided. He wouldn't let them win. He would find a way to turn this around, to prove that he was in the right all along. But as the hours passed, Calvin's confidence began to waver. He noticed the flight attendants avoiding eye contact with him, their movements deliberately casual whenever they passed his row. Even the co-pilot, Daniel, who occasionally checked in on passengers, seemed hesitant to engage with him. For the first time, Calvin felt truly isolated, a stranger among strangers. Up in first class, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Passengers began loosening up, chatting more openly about the earlier drama. Some praised Snoop for handling the situation with grace, while others expressed relief that Marcus had intervened. Laura moved around the cabin, discreetly interviewing, willing participants to gather additional perspectives. Each conversation added depth to her understanding of the event, reinforcing her belief that this story needed to be told. By the time dinner service began, the initial shock had faded somewhat. Plates of chicken and pasta were distributed, and the hum of conversation filled the cabin once again. But beneath the surface, a current of unease remained. Everyone knew that the flight still had several hours left and that Calvin was still on board. As night fell outside the windows, the cabin lights dimmed, casting soft shadows across the seats. Most passengers settled in for the long haul, pulling blankets over their laps or closing their eyes for a nap. Yet Laura remained awake, her mind buzzing with ideas. She knew the hardest part was yet to come, ensuring that Calvin's actions didn't go unnoticed and that the lessons learned from this experience reached as many people as possible. And somewhere in the darkness, Calvin sat, wide awake, staring out the window at the endless expanse of stars. His mind churned with plans, excuses, and justifications, but also with doubts. Deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. As the hours ticked by, the plane cruised steadily through the night sky. Most passengers had drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle hum of the engines and the rhythmic rocking of the aircraft. Blankets were pulled up to chins, pillows adjusted. Against windows and soft snores filled the quiet cabin. But not everyone was resting. Calvin, still wide awake, sat rigidly in his seat, staring blankly ahead as if trying to piece together a plan. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, fear, and desperation. He knew he couldn't let this situation end without regaining control, without proving that he was right. Meanwhile, Laura and Marcus remained alert, quietly discussing their next steps. They had moved to a pair of empty seats near the rear galley, away from prying ears. Laura's laptop glowed faintly in the dim light, illuminating her determined expression. She had already drafted an outline for her article, but wanted Marcus's input on how to frame the story effectively. "We need to focus on more than just what happened," she said softly, tapping the keys thoughtfully. It's about why it happened and how we can stop it from happening again. Marcus nodded, leaning back slightly in his seat. Exactly. Racism isn't just one person acting out. It's a symptom of something much bigger. If your article can shine a light on that, then you'll be doing something truly meaningful. Their conversation was interrupted when Daniel, the co-pilot, approached them. He looked tired but concerned, his uniform slightly rumpled from hours of monitoring the flight. I heard about what happened earlier, he began, keeping his voice low. I want you both to know that I'm taking this seriously. We've already contacted ground control to ensure proper authorities will handle things once we land. Laura exchanged a glance with Marcus before responding. Thank you for stepping in. It's clear that Calvin's behavior is unacceptable, but we're worried about what might happen during the rest of the flight. Do you think he could try something else? Daniel hesitated, clearly uneasy. I don't know him personally, but based on what I've seen tonight, I wouldn't rule it out. That's why we're keeping a close eye on him. Still, he trailed off, glancing toward the front of the plane. If anyone notices anything suspicious, please let us or the flight attendants know immediately. With that, Daniel excused himself, leaving Laura and Marcus to continue their planning. As they talked, they agreed that the key to preventing further trouble lay in staying vigilant and ensuring Calvin didn't have another chance to act recklessly. But neither of them anticipated just how quickly events would escalate. Back in his seat, Calvin felt increasingly cornered. Every glance from nearby passengers seemed accusatory, every whispered word a dagger aimed at his pride. He convinced himself that everyone on board was conspiring against him, that Snoop, Laura, Marcus, even the flight crew were all part of some grand scheme to ruin him. His paranoia grew until it consumed him entirely, pushing rational thought aside. In a sudden burst of determination, Calvin unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Ignoring the curious stares of those around him, he marched toward the cockpit door. His heart pounded wildly in his chest as he reached for the handle, fully intending to confront Daniel and demand answers, or perhaps even take drastic measures to reclaim authority over the flight. But before he could open the door, a firm hand grabbed his arm. Calvin spun around to find Marcus standing there, his presence commanding yet calm. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus asked, his tone steady but firm. Calvin yanked his arm free, glaring at Marcus. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, his voice dripping with hostility. "Stay out of my way." "No," Marcus replied simply, planting himself firmly between Calvin and the cockpit. "You're causing enough problems already. Whatever you're planning, it stops now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension crackling like static electricity. Passengers nearby woke up, sensing the brewing confrontation. Some sat upright in alarm, while others cautiously reached for their phones to record the scene. Laura, who had been observing from her seat, quickly joined the group, positioning herself strategically to intervene if necessary. "You don't understand," Calvin growled, his face flushed with rage. "They're trying to destroy me. To make me look like the bad guy. I won't let them get away with it." "Destroy you?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "Man, nobody's out to get you. You did this to yourself. All we're asking is for you to sit down and behave like a human being." Calvin clenched his fists, trembling with barely contained fury. For a terrifying second, it seemed like he might lash out physically. But then, as if struck by a sudden realization, his shoulders sagged slightly. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a mix of shame and resignation. Without another word, he turned and shuffled back to his seat, collapsing into it like a deflated balloon. The cabin erupted into murmurs as passengers processed what had just happened. Many breathed sighs of relief, grateful that Marcus had managed to prevent a potentially disastrous outcome. Laura returned to her seat, her hands shaking slightly as she added final notes to her draft. She couldn't help but marvel at how quickly situations could spiral, and how crucial it was to have someone like Marcus step in when they did. As the adrenaline faded, Marcus rejoined Laura, sinking into the seat beside her. "That was intense," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "I didn't expect him to go after the cockpit." "Neither did I," Laura replied, her voice tinged with awe. "You handled it perfectly, though. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Marcus shrugged modestly. "Just doing what needed to be done. Honestly, I've dealt with worse situations in the military. This guy, he's just scared. Scared of losing control, scared of being exposed for who he really is." Laura nodded thoughtfully. "And that's exactly why this story matters. People like him. They hide behind excuses because they don't want to face their own biases. But if we can show others what happens when those biases boil over, maybe we can start changing things." With renewed resolve, Laura finalized her draft, weaving together the accounts she'd gathered throughout the flight. She included quotes from Snoop, reflections from Marcus, and insights from other passengers who had witnessed the drama unfold. By the time she hit save, the first hints of dawn were beginning to peek through the windows, painting the cabin in soft hues of orange and pink. Up front, Snoop glanced outside, watching the sunrise with a serene expression. Despite everything that had happened, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this experience could lead to something positive, a spark of change in a world that desperately needed it. And somewhere in the back of the plane, Calvin stared silently at the floor, his mind heavy with regret. Whether he realized it or not, the journey ahead wouldn't just involve landing safely. It would require facing the consequences of his actions and perhaps beginning the long process of self-reflection. The plane continued its descent toward New York City, carrying with it stories of courage, resilience, and the enduring fight for justice. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds as the plane began its descent toward JFK Airport. The hum of the engines grew louder, signaling the end of a long and eventful flight. For most passengers, the sight of New York City's skyline emerging on the horizon brought relief, the promise of solid ground beneath their feet after hours suspended miles above it. But for Calvin, the approaching landing felt like stepping into a courtroom where judgment awaited. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What would happen once they touched down? Would he be arrested, humiliated in front of everyone? Or worse, would this incident follow him for the rest of his life? Near the front of the plane, Snoop leaned back in his seat, watching the city come into view. He had seen plenty of drama throughout his career, but this flight stood out, not because of the confrontation itself, but because of what it revealed about human nature. Racism wasn't new to him. He'd faced it countless times before. Yet witnessing how quickly tensions escalated, and how one man's unchecked prejudice could disrupt an entire plane, left him reflective. As the wheels of the aircraft touched, down with a gentle thud, he turned to Laura, who was seated nearby. "This ain't over yet," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But I hope people learned something from all this." Laura nodded, her laptop tucked safely into her bag. She had sent her draft article to her editor during the final leg of the journey, confident that the story would resonate with readers. Still, she couldn't shake the weight of responsibility she now carried. Writing about injustice was one thing, but ensuring that the narrative sparked meaningful change was another challenge entirely. "We'll see," she replied, offering a small smile. "If nothing else, maybe this gets people talking." As the plane taxied to the gate, anticipation crackled through the cabin. Passengers glanced toward the windows, spotting federal agents waiting on the tarmac. Their presence confirmed what many had suspected. Calvin wouldn't simply walk away unscathed. When the seatbelt sign finally switched off, a collective sigh rippled through the rows. People unbuckled cautiously, gathering their belongings as if bracing themselves for whatever came next. Calvin remained frozen in his seat, his face pale and drawn. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a personal failure, it was public humiliation. Every step he took off the plane would be scrutinized, recorded, shared. His reputation, painstakingly built over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. A bitter taste filled his mouth as he thought about the headlines that would surely follow. Pilot assaults, celebrity mid-flight, racist outburst shocks passengers. Each imagined title felt like a punch to the gut. When a flight attendant approached him, her expression neutral but firm, Calvin knew there was no escape. "Sir, please follow me," she instructed, gesturing toward the exit. Her tone left no room for argument. Slowly, reluctantly, he rose from his seat and shuffled forward, avoiding eye contact with anyone around him. The aisle seemed impossibly long, each step heavier than the last. Whispers followed him, some sympathetic, others scathing. By the time he reached the door, his hands trembled visibly. Outside, the federal agents stepped aboard, their authoritative presence silencing the murmurs inside. Two of them moved to flank Calvin, guiding him toward the open doorway. Cameras flashed as reporters captured the moment, their lenses trained on the disgraced pilot. Calvin lowered his head, unable to meet the stares of strangers or the glare of flashing lights. As he descended the stairs onto the tarmac, the full weight of his actions settled over him. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. Back inside the plane, passengers erupted into applause. It started softly, a few claps here and there, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. Some cheered, others wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the culmination of emotions they'd experienced together. Marcus stood near the front of the cabin, nodding approvingly as the agents led Calvin away. "That's justice," he murmured, though not loudly enough for anyone else to hear. Snoop rose from his seat, stretching lazily as if unaffected by the chaos. But when reporters swarmed the jet bridge, microphones thrust in his direction, his demeanor shifted. He paused briefly, addressing the crowd with characteristic poise. "What happened today wasn't about me," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise. "It was about showing folks that hate don't win. Not when we stand up against it. We gotta keep fighting for respect, for equality, for everybody." His words resonated deeply with those present, drawing nods of agreement from passengers disembarking behind him. Laura lingered near the exit, snapping photos and jotting down notes as the scene unfolded. She knew this moment would become the centerpiece of her article, a powerful reminder of resilience in the face of adversity. Once the initial frenzy subsided, the airline issued a formal apology, acknowledging the distress caused by Calvin's behavior. They announced plans to implement mandatory diversity training for all staff and pledged transparency moving forward. While these measures were welcomed, many passengers agreed that real change required more than policy updates. It demanded accountability at every level. For Laura, the day's events reinforced her commitment to storytelling. Back at her hotel later that evening, she polished her article, weaving together interviews, observations, and reflections. She titled it, "Above the Clouds, Confronting Prejudice at 35,000 Feet, and submitted it with pride. Within hours, the piece went live online, sparking widespread discussion. Readers praised her courage in documenting the incident, while critics debated whether systemic racism could ever truly be eradicated. Meanwhile, Marcus reflected on the role he'd played in diffusing the conflict. Speaking with Laura over coffee the following morning, he admitted feeling grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. "Sometimes, standing up isn't about grand gestures," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "It's about showing up when it matters most." By midweek, news outlets across the country had picked up the story. Calvin's name became synonymous with intolerance, his career effectively destroyed. Though some defended him, arguing that stress or personal struggles might have influenced his behavior, the majority condemned his actions as unacceptable under any circumstances. Legal proceedings loomed ahead, promising further scrutiny and consequences. As the days passed, life gradually returned to normal for the other passengers. Snoop resumed his music projects, inspired to write lyrics addressing themes of unity and perseverance. Laura earned recognition for her work, securing a promotion at her publication. And Marcus reconnected with old friends from the military, reigniting his passion for mentoring young leaders. Yet even as they moved forward, none of them forgot the lessons learned aboard that fateful flight. Racism wasn't confined to a single individual. It thrived in silence, in systems that failed to challenge it. By speaking out, by refusing to let hatred go unchecked, they had taken a stand, not just for themselves but for future generations. The plane may have landed, but the ripple effects of their actions continued to spread, reminding everyone that change often begins in unexpected places, even 35,000 feet above the ground. The days following the flight passed quickly, but the impact of what had happened lingered like ripples spreading across water. For Laura, the experience became a turning point, not just in her career, but in how she viewed her role as a journalist. Sitting in a quiet corner of a bustling New York City coffee shop, she reflected on everything that had transpired. Her laptop was open before her, its screen displaying the final draft of her article. Beside it lay her trusty notebook, pages filled with scribbled observations, quotes, and sketches of ideas. Across the table sat Marcus, who had agreed to meet her one last time to discuss the aftermath of the incident. "You know," Laura began, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, "I've written plenty of stories before, but this one, it feels different. Like it's not just about reporting facts. It's about making people think." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression calm but attentive. "That's because it is different. Stories like this, they have power. They make people uncomfortable, sure, but that's how change starts. Discomfort leads to questions, and questions lead to answers." Laura smiled faintly, appreciating his insight. She had always admired Marcus's ability to see the bigger picture, even in chaotic situations. Over the past few days, they had exchanged messages, sharing updates on how the story was being received, and discussing ways to keep the conversation alive. Now, face to face, she felt a renewed sense of determination. "Do you think we did enough?" she asked after a pause. "I mean, exposing Calvin's actions was important, but will it actually stop others like him?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Stopping racism isn't something one person or one story can do alone. It's a collective effort, a constant push against systems that try to hold us back. What you've done is shine a light on a problem most people would rather ignore. That's huge." His words reassured her, though doubts still lingered. Laura knew that writing the article wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Change required action, persistence, and courage. As she scrolled through comments on her piece, she saw evidence of both hope and resistance. Some readers praised her for shedding light on an uncomfortable truth, while others dismissed the incident as exaggerated or irrelevant. But amidst the noise, there were voices of gratitude, people thanking her for giving them the language to talk about prejudice and discrimination. Meanwhile, Snoop had returned to Los Angeles, where he resumed work on his latest music project. Inspired by the events on the plane, he decided to channel his emotions into a new song titled "Clouds Don't Discriminate." The track blended smooth beats with poignant lyrics about unity, resilience, and the importance of standing up against injustice. When it dropped online a week later, it quickly gained traction, resonating with fans worldwide. In interviews, Snoop emphasized that the song wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever faced hatred and found strength in solidarity. Back in New York, Calvin's life unraveled further. Legal proceedings moved forward, with charges filed against him for assault and misconduct. The airline terminated his employment, citing violations of company policy and ethical standards. News outlets continued to cover his downfall, painting him as a cautionary tale of unchecked prejudice. Friends and family distanced themselves, unwilling to defend his actions. Alone and disgraced, Calvin retreated from public view, leaving behind a legacy of regret and missed opportunities for growth. For the other passengers, the flight remained a defining moment, a shared experience that bonded them in unexpected ways. Many stayed in touch through social media, exchanging messages of support and encouragement. One passenger, a teacher named Emily, organized a virtual meeting so everyone could reconnect and reflect. During the call, participants shared how the incident had impacted their perspectives. Some spoke of newfound empathy, while others expressed a desire to advocate for equality in their own communities. Laura listened intently during the meeting, taking notes for a potential follow-up piece. She realized that the story didn't belong solely to her. It belonged to everyone who had been part of that journey. Each passenger carried a piece of it, contributing to a larger narrative about humanity's capacity for both harm and healing. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of the flight continued to spread. The airline implemented sweeping reforms, introducing stricter guidelines for employee behavior, and launching initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion. Other companies in the aviation industry took notice, adopting similar measures to prevent future incidents. Laura's article became required reading in training programs, serving as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias. In her personal life, Laura found herself growing more confident in her voice as a writer. Editors praised her ability to tackle complex issues with clarity and compassion. Her promotion opened doors to new opportunities, allowing her to pursue stories that challenged societal norms and inspired action. Yet despite her success, she never forgot the lessons she learned aboard that plane. That courage often comes in small acts, and that speaking out matters, even when it feels daunting. Marcus, too, embraced a new chapter in his life. Inspired by the connections he'd made during the flight, he began mentoring young leaders in underserved communities. Drawing on his military experience, he taught workshops on conflict resolution and leadership, emphasizing the importance of empathy and accountability. He often reminded his students that heroism wasn't defined by grand gestures. It was about showing up when it mattered most. One evening, months after the flight, Laura received an email from Marcus. Attached was a photo of him standing in front of a classroom, surrounded by eager faces. "Just wanted to share a little update," he wrote. "These kids remind me every day why it's worth fighting for a better world. Thought you'd appreciate seeing the progress." Tears welled in Laura's eyes as she stared at the image. It was a testament to the enduring power of hope, the belief that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. She replied, simply, "Thank you. This means everything." And so life moved forward for everyone touched by the events of that unforgettable flight. Though paths diverged and challenges arose, the memory of standing together against hate remained etched in their hearts. They had proven that unity could overcome division, that courage could silence fear, and that justice, though imperfect, was always worth pursuing. Somewhere high above the clouds, another plane soared toward its destination, carrying passengers unaware of the legacy left behind by those who had flown before them. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, a canvas of possibility, waiting to be shaped by the choices of those below.